Hello. Thank you for coming. Before I start, I just wanted to, if I may, dedicate this talk to the memory of Nick Howe, a friend of mine who died last month. Nick was a traveler, a travel writer, a scholar of travel writing, a good friend, a wonderful colleague, and many of the things that I will talk about today have benefited from his input. So let's talk about Dashkova now. Ekaterina Romanovna Dashkova spent roughly a decade abroad, making 2 extended European tours. The first lasted for 4 years, from 1769 to 1773, and I noted that in the exhibition we differ a little bit on our dates. I'm not sure. According to the exhibition, she was abroad for about 8 years. I think she was abroad for about 11, but I'll have to check on it. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm going to talk about 11 years, okay? The first trip being 4 years and the second 7. It began in 1775 and finished in 1782. So what I'd like to do today is to discuss these travels in their general outline and also the ways in which Dashkova chose to describe them and herself in 3 different texts. One of these is her well-known memoirs, or Mon Histoire, that she wrote towards the end of her life in 1805. It provides a general, if retrospective, overview of her travels and thus serves as useful background for the other 2. Both of those are relatively obscure accounts of brief excursions in Britain. One describes a circuit of southwest England made during Dashkova's first journey abroad, and the other one a tour of the Scottish Highlands made during her second. As we will discuss shortly, both of these texts were important milestones in the history of Russian literary travel writing. When I speak of travel today, I generally mean leisure touring. This was a new type of private elite travel that became fashionable in Western Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, and which first became known in Russia, it would seem, during the reign of Peter the Great in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Russian familiarity with the practice of leisure touring increased over the course of the 18th century and received a significant boost in 1762 when Dashkova, together with other members of the Russian nobility, was granted the right to travel abroad. This by Catherine's husband and predecessor, Peter III. Catherine forcibly deposed her husband after he had reigned for 6 months, and then later had him eliminated, but she confirmed the privilege of travel, together with another that Peter had bestowed, the right for male members of the nobility to decline state service. Now the Russian elite would have access to the months and even years of leisured time required for travel abroad. Another important prerequisite, of course, was money. Foreign touring required enormous funds. So how many Russians were able to engage in the practice of foreign travel? Well, it's a little bit hard to find precise statistics here, but the numbers are not terribly impressive. It's been estimated that only 5% of the Russian nobility in the late 18th century was able to afford tutors for their children. Clearly, many fewer would have been able to foot the cost of a grand tour. I've also read a suggestion that Dashkova was perhaps one of 100 Russian travelers who visited London in the 1770s and 1780s. It's a little hard to interpret those numbers because a lot of times servants, students, people that aren't very notable, very prominent, and maybe the heads of their traveling parties don't get noticed and fall through the cracks. But anyway, 100 seems very low to me. As I'll point out in a minute, Dashkova's own party, at least on her first trip, comprised a group of 5, excluding servants, and I don't think that they constituted 20% of Russian travelers to England over a 20-year period. Most of them went twice in that period anyway. Anyway, given the expense involved, it's not surprising that the first Russian travelers were generally among the most highly placed members of the elite, and Dashkova was no exception. Member of a prominent and powerful family, the Vorontsov clan, she was born a countess and married at age 16 to a prince. She also had direct ties to a number of sovereigns. Dashkova was raised in the home of an uncle who served as chancellor to the Empress Elizabeth. That empress was also Dashkova's godmother, while her godfather was Elizabeth's heir and successor, the famed Peter III, who lasted 6 months. Dashkova's sister was Peter III's mistress. Despite these ties, Dashkova supported Catherine's seizure of the throne and even claimed to have conceived the idea herself. She was rewarded for her participation with the position of lady-in-waiting in Catherine's court. I don't want to spend too much time on Dashkova's biography today. Let me just note that her first trip abroad seems to have followed a negative turn in her close relationship with Catherine that was due largely to Dashkova's antagonistic relationship with the parvenu Orlov family. This was a group of 5 brothers that included Catherine's favorite, Grigori. 2 of the brothers had been directly involved in Catherine's takeover, and all 5 were richly rewarded as a result. The rise of this family meant that several other traditionally powerful groups, such as the Vorontsovs, were forced to cede ground, leading to a great deal of rivalry, animosity, and irritation around the throne. Dashkova, who was only 19 at the time of Catherine's takeover, and thus 14 or 15 years younger than Catherine herself, certainly exaggerated her own role in these events. Although it's possible that she actually believed her own version, it also seems that she emphasizes her role in the coup precisely in order to protest the fame and recognition given to the Orlovs. At any rate, Dashkova's involvement greatly augmented foreign interest in her person and ensured that she would appear in numerous foreign records during her travels abroad. When Dashkova set off for her first trip in 1769, she was 26 years old and had been a widow for 5 years. She was accompanied by 2 children, a son and a daughter, their governess, and a Vorontsov cousin who was in the foreign service. Dashkova traveled under an assumed name on her first trip, Madame Mikhalkova. This was a fairly common practice for the highest echelons of the Russian elite and can be traced to the model of Peter the Great, who, at the end of the 17th century, toured Europe for a year and a half, posing as Peter Mikhailov. His disguise didn't fool anyone because he traveled with a retinue of 250 men, apparently. But he didn't want to be bothered, I guess, with the official state functions. Dashkova also explains her motivation for traveling incognito in practical terms. She simply wishes to avoid the expense of presenting herself at various foreign courts, an activity that would have been expected of the Princess Dashkova. The assumed name results in a number of amusing incidents that she recounts with glee in her memoirs, situations in which members of foreign society can't figure out who she is, and she either misleads them or doesn't tell them at all. In one such example, she visits Versailles as an ordinary tourist and watches the royal family dine. The other visitors decide that she is Dutch. Dashkova takes equal pleasure, it would seem, in situations where local magnates discover her identity, as was the case in Berlin and Baden, and insist that she partake of their hospitality. Here I should mention that in both her memoirs and travel accounts, Dashkova repeatedly indicates how well she was virtually always received. She meets royalty and princely families in Warsaw, Berlin, London, Versailles on a second trip, Turin, and Naples. While there may be a bit of vanity in such statements, they also serve to underline her social status, an important attribute of the leisured traveler in Russia at the time. In fact, it was such a widespread practice in descriptions of travel to emphasize being well received that I've lately begun to think that this was simply a form of good manners, i.e. a way of politely indicating gratitude to the host. Before discussing in more detail where Dashkova went and what she did, let me say a few words about 18th century tourism in general. The best-known version of leisured elite travel was the Grand Tour, an extensive journey through various countries that endorsed and confirmed the cultural significance of Western Europe. The most influential model for this practice was the British prototype, which intended to familiarize young members of the nobility and later of the bourgeoisie with modern languages, contemporary society, and monuments of Western culture. It was hoped that completing the tour would allow these young travelers to maintain or improve their social position by granting them access to important political and professional roles. There were various possible routes for the tour. In its ideal version, British tourists crossed the Channel and made a lap of the continent. Routes were usually planned according to seasons. They tried to avoid snow and traversing the Alps, for example, or to reach Rome in time to see the festivities of Holy Week. The direction of river flow was also important. Travelers went south along the Rhone and north along the Rhine. Their ultimate destination was typically Rome or Naples, where they would examine the ruins of Greek and Roman antiquity, together with monuments of Renaissance and Baroque architecture. There was also an English model for internal tourism, dedicated largely to celebrating the lifestyle and homes of the rural gentry. Many lavish estates functioned as tourist attractions in the 18th century and were open for the visits of elite travelers. Although the Russian version of the Grand Tour resembled the classic Western paradigm in many respects, the itineraries were necessarily quite distinct. Russian travelers followed different routes from their home on Europe's periphery to the continent's many centers of interest. Extensive journeys were required to even reach Western Europe after all, and Russians had to travel first through Poland, Prussia, and/or Austria before arriving at their destinations in Germany, the Low Countries, England, France, Switzerland, and/or Italy. On her first trip abroad, Dashkova traveled overland via Riga, Königsberg, Danzig to Berlin, where she spent some time as a guest of the Prussian royal family before traveling on to Aachen and Spa to take advantage of the baths and waters. At these resorts, she laid the foundation for several important friendships with English and Irish tourists. It was in Spa that Dashkova learned to read English, a skill that she claims to have mastered with the help of German and French in a mere 3 weeks. Like other members of the Vorontsov family, Dashkova was an Anglophile. Britophile would be more accurate, although in her usage, English often includes both Scottish and Irish. As she puts it at the beginning of her first account, I like England better than other states. Their governance, education, social etiquette, public and private life, mechanics, construction, and gardens all surpass the attempts of other peoples in similar undertakings. Accompanied by some of her new friends, Dashkova then went on to England, where she enrolled her son in a London school, and together with the rest of the group made the brief tour in southwest England that is described in her first travelogue. The party then sets off for the continent, heading to Brussels, Antwerp, and Paris. The account of this tour found in Dashkova's memoirs is lively and entertaining. Among the most interesting passages are her descriptions of meetings with famous personalities. The highlight of her visit to Paris was apparently a series of meetings with Diderot, one of the French Enlightenment figures that had a close connection with Russia, having found support in the person of Catherine herself. My stay in Paris, she writes, was very short, only 17 days, during which I wanted to see no one except Diderot. Nonetheless, she also, quote, went round churches and monuments and visited the studios of famous artists as well as theaters. In the theater, she writes, I always sat in the gallery among the humblest members of the audience, wearing an old black dress and shawl and a close cap in order to escape all notice. Here we have an example of the professions of modesty and asceticism that typified Dashkova's record, even while contradicting her equally characteristic exertions of her own importance. According to Dashkova, Diderot adulates her and even snubs other important acquaintances in order to maximize their time together. He often remains after dinner to talk with her until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. One evening, after hearing Dashkova's defense of Russian serfdom, this brilliant intellect supposedly exclaimed, "What a woman you are! You have upset ideas that I have cherished and upheld for 20 years." It's interesting to note that Diderot's own version of events does not report constant socializing with the Russian princess, but recalls having met with her, if I recall correctly, 2 or 3 times. From Paris, Dashkova travels to Provence, where she winters with English and Irish friends before setting out with them in the spring to Switzerland. The day after my arrival at Geneva, she recalls, I sent to beg Voltaire's permission for me and my companions to see him the following day. He was very ill, but all the same sent a message to say that he would have great pleasure in seeing me and that I could bring anyone I liked to see him entirely at my own discretion. And Dashkova takes him up on the offer. In the evening of the day appointed, she writes, I went to see Voltaire together with Mrs. Hamilton, Lady Ryder, Miss Kaminskaya, that's her governess, my cousin Vorontsov, and Mr. Campbell of Sheffield. She is well received. The night before, Voltaire had lost over 16 ounces of blood, but he would not let anyone know this for fear I might not come. On entering his room, I found him stretched out in a lounge chair, weak and ailing. When Dashkova expressed her regret for troubling him, Voltaire raised both his arms, as is done on the stage, to mark his astonishment, and said, "Good heavens, even her voice is the voice of an angel." Dashkova then stays to dinner, a disappointing event due to the presence of Voltaire's annoyingly slow-witted niece, as she puts it, and the fact that the great writer had to kneel on a backward-facing chair throughout the meal due to his hemorrhoids. The memory of this disagreeable dinner faded somewhat in the days that followed, however, for Voltaire agreed to meet with Dashkova during the remainder of her stay for a series of morning tete-a-tetes. He was very different then, she remembers, and alone with him in his study or his garden, I found him to be such as I had imagined and pictured him to be from reading his books. Dashkova's group then travels along the Rhine to Baden, Frankfurt, and back to Spa. From there she heads home via Dresden, Berlin, and Riga, concluding her first trip. I'm not sure if it's on this trip or on her second trip that she supposes that she meets Franklin in Paris, because she doesn't mention that, the second one. She doesn't mention that in her memoirs. I learned that today at the exhibit, that she actually met him, so, which is good. I'm glad she did. As I mentioned, Dashkova wrote 2 brief travel accounts, the first of which describes a 2-week tour of southwest England made during her first extended journey. Accompanied by her daughter, her cousin, and the governess, because Dashkova's son remained in London to study, she traveled through Portsmouth, Bath, Bristol, Oxford, and a number of private estates. Dashkova published an account of this trip a few years later in 1775, the same year that she set off for her second grand tour. It appeared in the Journal of the Free Russian Assembly, a group sometimes described as Russia's first literary society, that had been founded at the University of Moscow with the aim of extending the university's beneficial influence beyond the walls of academe, what we might today call community outreach. The Free Russian Assembly was dedicated to the development of the Russian language, and Dashkova's account was written in Russian. Comprising 40 smallish pages, it bears the title, "The Journey of a Certain Distinguished Russian Lady Through Some English Provinces." In Russian, it's «Путешествие одной российской знатной госпожи по некоторым английским провинциям». This is an extremely important text. It is, as far as I know, the first published example in Russia of a travel account that describes the practice of leisure touring. I mean, exclusively describes the practice of leisure touring. You've got hints of it, and there are hints of it in other texts, but this is dedicated to leisure touring. This significant literary first is made even more impressive by the surprising fact that it was authored by a woman. Dashkova's second extended journey followed a similar route, although it also included sojourns in Scotland, Ireland, Italy, and Austria. She embarked on this trip, as she put it, to give my son a classical and university education, which she thought would take 9 or 10 years. Her son was only 13 at the time of departure, but it actually took only 3 or 4. Dashkova traveled with her son, her daughter, recently married, and her son-in-law, at least in the early stages of the trip. He soon left the group and returned home. They journeyed first to Spa via Warsaw and Berlin, then to England and Scotland. On the way to Edinburgh, Dashkova met the father of the 2 Wilmot sisters who were instrumental in the writing and publication of her diaries. Later, from her base in Scotland, she used the summers to tour the Highlands or to take the waters under doctor's orders at various resorts. When young Prince Dashkov graduated from the university, the Russians traveled to Ireland, where they visited friends, and then to London, where Dashkova was presented to the king and queen. Their journey continued through Brussels and Holland to Paris, this time for a longer stay, in which Dashkova renews old social acquaintances, makes new ones, such as Franklin, and is officially presented to the court at Versailles. She then passes through Switzerland and over the Alps into Italy, where she visits numerous cities and socializes with local and foreign notables, including English tourists, Russian artists, and diplomatic officials. Dashkova meets the royal families of both Savoy and Naples and impresses the latter with her inspired views on Pompeii. It was Dashkova's idea, we are told, to transform this archaeological site into a sort of open-air museum that, she argued, would easily become a popular destination for both tourists and scholars. Dashkova headed to Russia through Venice and Vienna, where she held her own in a discussion with the difficult First Minister on the role of Peter the Great in Russian history. She then returned to Russia after visiting Saxony and Berlin. Dashkova's second travel account was written during this tour. Shaped as a private letter and addressed to her friend Elizabeth Morgan, it describes a 2-week excursion in the Scottish Highlands undertaken together with her son and daughter in 1777 during the University of Edinburgh's summer holidays. Written in French rather than Russian and entitled The Small Tour in the Highlands, or Le Petit Tour dans les Highlands, dans les Îlets, this text remained unpublished until 1995. Let me point out here that publication was not yet a defining feature of the literary in 18th century Russia, and in particular, there was a venerable tradition of travel writing that remained in manuscript form. Elite travelers had been encoding the leisured tour abroad with cultural significance long before literary travel writing developed into a standardized public genre. They recorded their experiences in diaries or letters that were to be shared informally with friends and family. It's quite likely, in fact, that Dashkova found models for her own travel writing in manuscript accounts. As member of a well-traveled diplomatic family, she belonged to the aristocratic circles in which such texts were generated and was perhaps familiar with the description of life in France written by her elder brother Alexander, who had studied there in 1758 and 59. Le Petit Tour also represents an important cultural milestone. It is perhaps the earliest example of a full-fledged literary travel account in Russian tradition. As I'll explain shortly, Dashkova's first text, The Journey of a Distinguished Russian Lady, was an important step towards the literary account, but it ultimately lacks the saturation of specific features that came to characterize the evolving literary mode of travel writing. In fact, a comparison of Dashkova's 2 travelogues is interesting for what it can show us about how literary travel writing developed in Russia. Both texts indicate that Dashkova felt the appeal of elite Western touristic procedures and literary practices, although the first text is more impersonal, while the second demonstrates her growing awareness of travel writing's literary potential and of the specific features required for its literary stylization. In Le Petit Tour, in other words, Dashkova employs more standardized techniques to greater literary effect. Chief among her accomplishments is the creation of a well-defined narratorial figure in the persona of the traveler. What I'm calling literary travel writing was a mode of travel description originally conceived as a vehicle for the record of leisured touring, which, as I mentioned, was a type of private elite travel that Russians first encountered during their sojourns abroad in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Literary travel writing was distinct from other types of travel description, such as the scientific records of expeditions or diplomatic reports, the accounts of merchants, pilgrims, and military officers, and even tourist guidebooks, in which significant quantities of information are conveyed in a largely impersonal and thus presumably objective manner. Informational tasks were important for the literary account as well, but these were subject to certain norms of literary stylization and, in particular, to the organization and control of an increasingly evident narratorial persona. In other words, the information about foreign lands found in the literary account is presented as issuing from the pen of a specific individual traveler. By this I mean an ostensibly specific and individual traveler. In point of fact, these figures are shaped according to contemporary literary fashion and thus are often quite similar. The ideas that we get from travel writing then about actual people and what they actually did need to be taken with a grain of salt. As I've suggested, the literary mode of travel writing developed hand in hand with the increased exposure to Western European landscapes and cultures that began in 1762, when Russian nobles were granted the right to travel abroad. In the last third of the 18th century, literary travel writing became extremely important in Russian culture, helping to lay the foundation for descriptions of place and of the Russian found in the later works of 19th century prose writers such as Gogol, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, and Tolstoy. Since literary travel writing was modeled on Western paradigms, it is not surprising that it first appeared in Russian accounts of travel to Western Europe. Even at the beginning of the 18th century, leisure travelers were highly self-conscious of participating in a special practice. In travel, what we might call travel with a capital T became a separate category of behavior. In point of fact, the modern Russian word for journey, puteshestvие, seems to have become common precisely in the last third of the 18th century in order to describe the type of self-conscious travel associated with leisure touring. It is instructive to note that during her 11 years abroad, Dashkova wrote only 2 very brief travel accounts, both of which document her participation in established cultural rituals. She was inspired to write, in other words, not simply by the fact that she was traveling outside of Russia, but by the fact that once abroad, she was behaving as Western tourists did. She records her travels only when they reflect foreign touristic fashions. Still more telling in this respect is the title of her second account, Le Petit Tour, not a small tour, but the small tour of the Highlands, which again underlines the fact that her excursion was a standardized touristic activity. Like other Grand Tour accounts, Dashkova's texts acknowledge the informational tasks commonly expected of travel writing and of leisure travel writing in particular. A central focus of the Grand Tour account was civic description or commentary on local architecture, such as churches, historic buildings, suggestive ruins, and so on entertainments, especially the theater, on parks and gardens, promenades, menageries, museums, galleries, libraries, and public institutions, including prisons, hospitals, orphanages, and universities. Dashkova's civic descriptions point out the highlights of the cities and private estates that she visits and offer her evaluative remarks on architecture and gardens. While she sometimes addresses scientific, technical, and economic topics, she focuses primarily on societal and cultural themes, the landscapes, both literal and figurative, of elite society. Nonetheless, Dashkova seems to feel that her attention to such matters should be contextualized in a more objective scientific frame. She places her most substantive comments on industrial and agricultural topics, for example, primarily at the beginning and end of her accounts, as if to anchor her social and cultural concerns in a more serious discourse. Even the more personalized Le Petit Tour concludes with a brief appendix entitled General Ideas on a Part of Scotland, in which Dashkova summarizes her judgments on subjects such as Highland character, soil quality, road building, cattle, which she deems to be small and poorly fed, peasant homesteads, which she describes as frightful, and grander houses made without the least taste nor any sort of genre or order of architecture. She likes to point out the orders of architecture when she goes from building to building, so when she finds a home that doesn't have an order of architecture, that's a shortcoming. This informational addendum ensures that Dashkova's literary propensities did not ultimately prevent her travel account from being instructive. It may also reflect her ideas about genre, that is to say, about the sort of orientation that ought to constitute, or at least provide context for an account of personal leisured travel, perhaps especially one destined for publication and written by a woman. Dashkova's travelogues also contain an explicit layer of social information. She often lists her companions and acquaintances by name and title, commenting on their charming or praiseworthy qualities. Such passages function to explain the importance of Dashkova's associates and, by extension, of Dashkova herself. Some of the more striking passages in Dashkova's first account, striking because she goes into more detail or writes with particular enthusiasm or energy, are her reviews of country homes and gardens, her description of social practices in Bath and Bristol, including an explanation of how one goes about taking the waters, and her account of the organization of Oxford University. In reviewing private homes, she evaluates architecture, wallpaper, furnishings, and artwork, thus indicating her familiarity with elite Western fashions and systems of taste. Dashkova makes aesthetic judgments with aplomb, using the travelogue to demonstrate her own critical intellect and sense of style. She praises the work of artists such as Van Dyck, Rubens, and Hogarth, for example, and in her treatment of garden design and landscaping explains and promotes the English garden. In one extended passage, she describes moving through a private garden step by step in order to demonstrate how its careful planning produced a concatenation of impressions and optical effects. She lauds cultivated fields with their reflection of rural prosperity and the Gothic or Ossianic corners within private parks. After viewing the so-called hermitage of one Scottish estate, so-called hermitage is her phrase, she enumerates its multiple failings. Quote, these hermitages are interesting. Well, I think it's not clear, I don't think, from what I'm going to quote here, but in these elaborate gardens there were little hermitages, and then there were little hermits that were, I don't know who these people were, not necessarily little, but the landowners hired people or had servants or somebody that would stay there and act out the part of being the hermit. And part of her criticism is, that this guy wasn't really serious. He didn't really convince you that he was a hermit, or he was a good hermit. But I don't have that part of the quote here. This is about the building itself, the so-called hermitage. The building in question is neither temple, nor salon, nor office, nor solitary retreat, but a room that I imagine could not have been constructed by other than an innkeeper from a small German village in one of the corners of his garden in order to smoke his pipe there over his accounts. I forgot to tell you that the road which leads to the cascade is as ridiculous as the building. Imagine some small shrubs and rose bushes planted along the two edges of a gravel road wide enough to allow a carriage to drive easily. But do not expect a single tree here that would give you even a bit of shade, and whose thick and outstretched branches would provide a somber and even solemn mass that would be essential to the character of this site. She approves another hermitage on a different estate, where the walls were cloaked with moss and the furniture covered with deerskin corresponded perfectly to the character of the habitation. In her anti-Rousseauian view, nature itself had no shape until acted upon by man. Uncultivated and untamed landscapes range, in her view, from terrible and arid to the most desolate and most disagreeable country that I've ever seen. That's in northern Scotland. Dashkova's carefully articulated criticisms reveal both a discerning mind behind the text and a sense that eventual readers will be interested in learning from her about foreign culture and simultaneously about how its various aspects are to be evaluated. Here, her travel writing prefigures the works of subsequent travelers, and especially Nikolai Karamzin, who is often considered the father of Russian literary travel writing and even of modern Russian literature, for his enormously influential Letters of a Russian Traveler that was published over a decade, from 1791 to 1801. Like Karamzin, Dashkova presents herself as a knowledgeable participant in Western culture, and with her text serves as a conduit for information about fashionable practices abroad. Her travel writing also functions on one hand as a celebration of self, and on the other as a manual for the elite Russian tourist abroad that illustrates how to behave when mingling in foreign society. She, too, uses the travel account as a testament to her own cosmopolitanism, and her similarly offhand manner, with its suggestion of a confident and casual relationship to Western Europe, became a common feature in later literary accounts. Dashkova also resembles Karamzin in her admiration for England and English country life, demonstrating an awareness of the fashionable ideas widely associated to that nation, ideas that resulted in part from England's own self-representation in the works of Defoe, Richardson, Sterne, and so on. Also like Karamzin, Dashkova represents the Russian abroad. Although she does not stress her Russianness at every turn, she does specify her nationality in the title of her first account, and defends and explains Russia in her conversations with foreigners. As befits a Russian noblewoman, she shows herself to be gracious, self-contained, and warmly welcomed wherever she goes. By earning foreign respect, Dashkova scores victories that are both personal and, because of her close link to Catherine, of national significance. She participates in Western rituals with great savoir-faire and claims a place for herself and for Russia among international elite society. As I mentioned, one of the most important features of literary travel writing, and one which distinguishes it sharply from other varieties, such as the diplomatic report, the brief diary, the scientific account of the academic traveler, and so on, is its attention to the figure of the traveler, or the narratorial persona. Dashkova's travel writing clearly indicates her familiarity with the poses, points of view, and turns of phrase that came to characterize the narratorial voice in literary accounts, first in Western Europe and then in Russia. The persona that emerges from her text is ebullient and impulsive, sensitive and affectionate, educated and modest, spontaneous and carefree. "I've finished with Inverary," she breaks off at one point, "because I don't like cold and inanimate descriptions." These qualities are particularly marked in Le Petit Tour, which responds more fully to the personalized and explicitly non-scientific stylization favored in the pre-romantic or sentimentalist era. At times, Dashkova even adopts an attitude of intellectual heedlessness, an interesting contradiction to the informational tendencies in her work. At the smelting works in Caron, I'm not sure how to say that, for example, she avoids discussing technical procedures at length by professing herself unable to understand them fully. Quote, "Since I'm not a mineralogist, and what I tell you, coming only from the creation of my own head, ought not to be read by anyone but you, I'll keep quiet." Given her later gift of a rich collection of minerals to Moscow University, Dashkova would seem to have been considerably more interested in the topic at hand than her protestations indicate. More generally, she was extremely well educated for her time and certainly could have used her travel letters to show or to at least imply a more profound knowledge of technical procedures. She chose instead to neglect such aspects of her actual life and travel experiences in order to embellish the fashionable literary traits of her narratorial persona. Dashkova also presents herself as an artless amateur in the field of letters. She writes by choice, as fashion decreed, rather than by necessity, and favors a casual, offhand approach to the act of writing. Her first text begins with a lengthy disclaimer in which Dashkova explains that the text was written at the behest of friends, and she negates here both any personal ambition to be an author and the suggestion that her writing might be of any interest or use. In Le Petit Tour, Dashkova describes the act of writing as a means both of expressing intimacy for the addressee and of experiencing creative enjoyment in doing so. In her words, "I for myself find pleasure in the writing of this, and my friend will have it in the reading." While Dashkova playfully deprecates her own travel writing as scrawling and scribbling, her insistence on literary amateurism must also be taken with a grain of salt. By 1777, she had written several verses and published both original and translated articles in addition to her earlier journey. She went on in later years to write 2 plays and actively edit a number of journals. Most importantly, of course, she was a member of the Free Russian Society and founder of the Russian Academy, an institution similarly intended to develop the Russian language. She served as director of both that academy and the Imperial Academy of Sciences. Dashkova's self-disparagement is also striking in light of her illustrious social rank, which she advertises in the title of her first account, The Journey of a Certain Distinguished Russian Lady, but chooses to downplay in the later and more literary Le Petit Tour. What is her motivation for doing so? To what extent was Dashkova's modest self-presentation encouraged by her gender? In 18th century Russia, as in the rest of Europe, there were numerous constraints placed on women who wished to write. Certain genres were deemed more appropriate for the female writer. These included a variety of lighter, minor forms, such as poetry, literary sketches, letters, diaries, and translations. Seen as belonging to the realm of private rather than public discourse, these were in keeping with the traditional female sphere. Women did not author histories or political essays or even encyclopedic travelogues, and although Dashkova professes in her memoirs to have been an avid reader of politics, history, and philosophy, she confined her own literary production, with the possible exception of her memoirs, to lighter fare. Dashkova's 2 brief travelogues do not describe her extended journeys abroad after all, but only small pieces of them, and both were styled as personal letters. I think I forgot to mention that her, the first one, The Journey of a Certain Distinguished Russian Lady, has a subtitle, Letter to a Friend, I think it is. And so therefore, when you read the opening, you're immediately brought to the private sphere of letter writing. I've got a long quote here of her the disclaimer that she uses to open this first account. Let me summarize it briefly. I don't want to go over time. If we review Dashkova's disclaimer, she has 3 pages of protestations and disclaimers at the beginning of her first account. She begins by specifying that she writes at the request of a very persistent friend who finally succeeded in overcoming her objections. Since Dashkova herself had been insisting for her own part on the worthlessness of these travel notes, it took some doing to convince her to publish them. She then defends the published text from further attack by pointing out that it is incomplete and represents only a selection of those parts that she likes best. Moreover, these are written down without embellishment or correction and reflect only what one was able to jot down after a tiring day of travel. She then quickly justifies even having kept a travel journal. She had originally intended to do so only for the purpose of having a souvenir of her trip, or as she puts it, for personal reminiscence. When she initially left Russia, however, friends besought her to share her experiences with them, and the form of her diary was altered as a result. It was not, she indicates, ambition to be a writer that led her to include this plenitude of personal details. In closing this disclaimer, Dashkova emphasizes her feelings or emotive inclinations. On one hand, she articulates a wish that a worthier brush could have painted this portrait, however incomplete, of England. On the other, she argues that her own expressions of feeling justify her attempt. It is sufficient that she feels what a poet may sometimes write with less sincerity. She also claims that her feelings for the addressee, an unspecified dear friend, cannot be moderated or contained. This just to give you an idea of the various ways that, the various postures that she assumes in a mere 3 pages before discussing her 2-week trip in southwest England. It's true that modest self-presentation may have been encouraged to some degree by Dashkova's gender, but the situation is a little more complicated in Russia. Studies of women's travel writing suggest that the texts of female authors are likely to be characterized, at least in part, by elements of feminine discourse, including many features that we find in Dashkova: disclaimers about scientific knowledge, an emphasis on being well received, or more generally, travelers' descriptions of others' reactions to them, and comments that her friends insisted upon the publication. In late 18th and early 19th century Russia, however, these same features were characteristic of much of men's writing. Modest self-presentation was the latest in literary fashion and widely adopted by male writers of the era. It reflected a pre-romantic or sentimentalist interest in delicate feelings and gentle tones. Since male writers favored feminine genres and cultivated a feminine drawing room style in their work, the feminine style was not necessarily a marker of secondary social or artistic status then, nor an indication of difficulty in assuming a commanding narratorial voice, such as what one might expect from a scientist, a male adventurer, an orientalist, a representative of the state, and so on. In this era, feminine style often simply goes hand in hand with the selection of genre, and it was frequently a masculine choice. In other words, the discreet pose that Dashkova assumes in Le Petit Tour accentuates the ostensibly private and personal nature of her travel writing, and thus, in accordance with contemporary fashions, its literary value. It's a way to make your text more literary, this sort of a feminine pose. There's a sliding scale in different kinds of travel writing between a more objective scientific approach and this more personal subjective approach. And the literary account that I've been talking about has the central figure of the narrator and emphasizes the subjective, personalized approach to travel. And also it contains a good deal of information, but it's always, as I said, organized from the point of view of this particular traveler, some kind of travel persona. And in order to claim literary status for your text, if you want to write a travelogue and have that be a literary travelogue, you need to have a persona in your text, is basically what I'm saying. And if you want to do it in a very fashionable way, that persona has to say things like, oh, I don't really understand anything about science, and I wouldn't publish this. I know there's nothing interesting here, but I have to publish it because my friends are saying that I should, and I was well received, everybody seems to like me, that kind of thing, which maybe this does characterize writing by women in other countries, and other cultures, and other periods. But in late 18th century and early 19th century Russia, it characterizes writing by men and women, both. In fact, it may well be that it's the masculinity of this feminine approach, the appeal of it for males, and the legitimization of the female approach because it's used by males that helps to lend legitimacy to Dashkova's own endeavor and enables her to publish her account in 1775, despite the fact that she is a woman. Actually, I think that with Dashkova, her literary voice seems to be a result both of this literary fashion and of her gender. I think gender does play a role because she does, 3 pages of disclaimers and at the beginning of the travelogue is a lot. She's more elaborate and more extensive than many. It's interesting to note that Dashkova never wields the pen on her own behalf, but claims always to write at the behest of friends. Even her memoirs, she carefully specifies, were written at the urging of an Irish friend and house guest. I want to pause for a moment to talk about her memoirs in a little bit more detail. I find myself wondering if the project of writing these, seeing as how memoirs are, this is a more monumental and comprehensive work than the 2 travel sketches that I've been discussing. I'm wondering if it somehow represents a coming into her own, perhaps the reflection of a certain confidence that she's managed to accrue with age and her importance over the years. The memoir genre is sometimes seen as appropriate for the woman writer in that it expresses personal or private concerns, but Dashkova's reminiscences were of another order. They may have been inspired by the memoirs of her brother Alexander, also written, I believe, in the early 19th century. At any rate, and despite her genre, Dashkova's life was of great public significance. Her close connection with Catherine, her participation in the coup that brought Catherine to power, and her administrative positions gave her a public status unprecedented for a woman in Russia at the time, with the notable exception of the 4 female empresses in 18th century Russia. But I think that this kind of public status is without parallel, to my knowledge, in subsequent Russian history as well. The writing of Dashkova's memoirs, therefore, was a blatantly public act, and she does what she can to obscure the transgressive nature of this act with a series of disclaimers and protestations of modesty and so on. She also intended that the memoirs remain unpublished until after her death. In fact, they remained unpublished for quite some time because her younger brother didn't want them to come to light. We might also take a moment to consider what kind of femininity it was that Dashkova represented. Not surprisingly, she often impressed contemporaries as masculine. Such evaluations confirm the obvious fact that her behavior was not always constrained or circumscribed by the models of femininity that were circulating in the era. Horace Walpole, one of her English acquaintances, described the Russian princess as, quote, speaking on all topics in a very rapid and lively manner, easily and without pedantry. She does not deign to trouble herself about clothing and myriad feminine concerns. This seems to be a pose that Dashkova herself advertised. Her memoirs repeatedly underline her lack of interest in material wealth and fine clothing, equating asceticism with intellectual virtue. She also emphasizes the masculine turn of her intellect from the review of her favorite childhood authors, Bayle, Montesquieu, Boileau, Helvetius, and so on, through her account of inspiring Catherine's coup, to her friendships with Diderot and Voltaire. Catherine was undoubtedly her model in this, as in much else. What's interesting here, though, is that while Dashkova, like Catherine, was obviously quite capable, at least in some contexts, of adopting a masculine position or stance of authority, she does not flaunt this in her written work. Despite her unique and unprecedented role in Russian society, in other words, Dashkova's written self-presentation relies heavily on the rhetoric of traditional feminine discourse. And I've talked about these various features that supposedly feminine characteristics that appear also in the writing of men of the era, but what men don't do, and Dashkova does at great length, is profess her maternal devotion throughout her memoirs and in a few passages in Le Petit Tour. Dashkova insists throughout her memoirs that both of her extended journeys were undertaken primarily for the benefit of her children. The first was projected, quote, in the hope that change of air and the actual traveling would benefit my children who suffered from rickets and had poor health. And the second was to educate her son at the University of Edinburgh. In several instances, she refuses social engagements because she is traveling not for herself but for her son and needs to carry out a strict program of educative travel for his sake. Even the Queen of England recognizes in Dashkova an excellent mother. I have always known, the monarch reportedly states, that there are few mothers like you. At which point Dashkova says, and you're a wonderful mother too, and then the Queen calls her children from some outlying palace to come back and meet Dashkova, and she says they were just charming. Little angels, all of them. At the conclusion of her second extended journey, Dashkova writes in her memoirs, thus ended a journey undertaken with modest means and requiring all the courage with which a mother's love can give. My son's education had been my dearest aim. I had wanted to preserve his principles intact and keep him away from the innumerable temptations which always lie in wait for a young man in his own country. This is kind of interesting because usually in Russian culture at the time there was a lot of criticism of foreign travel because it exposed tender Russian youth to the vices that you find abroad, but Dashkova's view is a little bit different. Better to take him over to Edinburgh where things are a little bit safer. So to sum up, what it meant for Dashkova as a woman to travel abroad and to assume the leading role in her travel party and then to describe the experience in writing of these travels can be inferred through her frequent emphasis on maternal duty. Nowhere does she indicate having been inspired to travel by any personal desire to see foreign climes. This relatively independent, highly placed, and enterprising woman who spent over 10 years abroad found it desirable to thoroughly couch her travels in the rhetoric of selfless motherhood. I want to mention one other thing, that a point that will bring us back to the beginning of the talk. I mentioned at the beginning that in 1762, Peter III gave the Russian nobility the right to decline state service and to travel abroad. So at this point, greater numbers of them travel. And what happens, one might think initially, is that given the freedom, you don't have to work anymore if you've got the money. Why not just never come back or travel and so on? But what happens actually is that in Russia, like in Western Europe, there develops a use of travel as a kind of preparatory ritual for careers in state service. So people don't stop serving, but now they travel first, and then they come back and they get better jobs or more illustrious positions. And one important an example of this is Vladimir Orlov. I was talking about the Orlov family before that helped Catherine to the throne. There were, like I said, two Orlov brothers were instrumental in Catherine's takeover. The youngest Orlov brother was sent abroad. They were all given the title of counts as a reward for helping Catherine. And then the youngest one was sent abroad to study in Leipzig. And when he came back, he got a court position, and then he was, after a few years, named director of the Academy of Sciences, and he was Catherine Dashkova's predecessor in this role. And that got me thinking, and it's interesting because when you talk about the privilege of declining state service, that's something that applies only to men, because women didn't serve the state except for the 4 empresses of Dashkova. And but this is exactly what happened to Dashkova too. Her travels abroad serve as a grand tour, also in the way that in the sense that when she comes back, she has some kind of access. I'm not sure. In her memoir, she talks about this all as being a big surprise. You know, Catherine surprises her with this. I don't know. I mean, she kind of, if she's going to use feminine discourse, she needs to talk about it that way rather than in terms of her personal ambition. But she returned from Russia, returned to Russia after a second trip at the age of 39, and within 6 months she was running the Academy of Sciences, and I think there is a link there between not necessarily what she learned abroad and but there was a perception, at least on Catherine's part, or in Russia, that's important to go abroad. You learn things there. You're different when you come back, and we want to use that somehow in our administration. So, thank you. That's it.